I'm James Bennett, and I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Humphrey McQueen for a second performance today. This morning in the history seminar was just a warm-up for our Radical Newcastle event today. Over lunch I heard a colleague say about me, what does he know about radicalism? Well, Humphrey McQueen to the rescue.
Is that an admission?
Thanks.
Thanks very much. I want to come back here again because 5 minutes ago we all see there were 6 of us and I thought we could just sit in a circle and chat. But that's clearly not going to work very well. So, I'm so pleased that there is all this enthusiasm for Radical Newcastle because it matches my own to the city over now 40 years since I first came. I was invited then, in 1971, to speak at a anti-Vietnam moratorium. And I came up on the day before the moratorium and we went to the Workers' Club. And Peter Barrack was secretary of the Trades and Labour Council, what it was then called. Trades Hall Council. And doing the usual things. And he said, someone downstairs I want to introduce you to. Down we went into the gym, and there's boxing rings, people sparring and boxing, and there's a couple of young blokes boxing away. And we stood beside them for a while and pointed to one of them and said, oh, that's so-and-so. He's going down to Sydney on Friday night to contest the amateur welterweight championship. And I thought, oh, there's local pride, and there's Darcy, and this wild out here. So they called him over, introduced him to me, and mouthpiece him and brought me up. And we walked back upstairs, and Peter said to me, he'll be looking out for you tomorrow. And I said, are you expecting trouble? We never have any trouble. But in the 30s, of course, there had been a lot of trouble. The new guard had knocked radical speakers and communists off their perches. And indeed, there's lesson they had learned that this young boxer was there to guard my back. And doubtless all the other speakers and people had their own as well. One designated to each just to watch out for them. So the next day comes and we assemble up by the beach. Steel workers, coal miners, seamen, waterside workers, several thousand. And we start to march down Hunter Street. And as one of the speakers, I'm in the front rows. We get to the post office and as you know, there's a small war memorial. Just a very small single print like this. We stopped there for a brief speech given by a coal miner from further up the Hunter. And he said, when I was 17, I was stupid enough to put my age on to volunteer to go and fight for king, country and empire. I'm pleased to say that in 1941, my son went off to fight the fascists. And we're both here today to make sure that they don't conscript my grandson to fight for the US imperialists. And we proceeded down the street. When we got to the bottom of Hunter Street at the V junction there, we all sat down. I have to tell you that my previous experiences of marching along broad streets like this with 5,000 people behind me were of Sydney University students. A very different feeling to be followed by 5,000 industrial workers when you're confronting a row of policemen in front of you than it is with 5,000 undergraduates. So we sat down. The local police commander with all his silver braid came over to us and I was sitting beside Peter Barrack. And he leant down and he said, "Excuse me, Mr. Barrack, But will you be long? And that, of course, is the sense of radical Newcastle personified. Decades of building that up. I mean, that just doesn't fall out of the sky. The relationships like that, I mean, the police don't think. Well, first of all, we're going to lose. If it came to a stoush between the number of police and the number of armed workers there, there's no doubt who was going to win. But nonetheless, over the decades, that social or political relationship between the police and the organised labour movement in the town was clearly there. I was saying this morning that I was in Japan when the earthquake hit Newcastle. So earthquakes have become an everyday occurrence for me. In fact, I had a kind of routine with earthquakes in Japan. You've got to get a backpack full of water and food and ground shoes and things, and you keep that by the door. And when the earthquake starts, you rush to the door, open it, and shove an old shoe in it. So if the building changes shape, you can still get out. And you turn the gas off. These are the basic drill. Well, I used to do all that, and then I rushed to the back balcony. I was on the 8th floor. I could look out to the only really tall building then in Tokyo, a 60-storey building called the Sunshine Building. And in the earthquakes, it used to do this. And so I should watch it do this. There's probably the only real danger of really don't work is when they do this. Then you're in serious trouble. So I just stay there and just watch this building shape like this. Never seen anything like that in Australia. So I'd become quite accustomed. There'd been a big earthquake in California earlier. But when I heard the news of the Newcastle earthquake, it affected me emotionally in a way in which even the ones I'd been in, killed or hearing about the Los Angeles, San Francisco ones, did not. Because it struck so many of the people killed in the workers' strike, where I'd been more than once on other occasions for political events and things here. And had known, one of the things the Workers' Club did, of course, was to recycle a lot of the money into providing services for aid pensions, virtually free meals, in effect. And of course, why they were there on that particular day, at that time, was connected to that. So it had that real feeling for me then. And I was saying to people today, from 1971 when I first arrived, my fantasy was, if only we could move the National Library, the National Archives, the War Memorial, and a couple of other research resources to Newcastle, I would move in, buy one of those terraces up by the ocean and swim there every day. This seemed to me to be the ideal life that anyone could have in this, what was then still the industrial steel town. When I was in the back country here at 18 months ago, or nearly 2 years ago now, we were driving back down from Queensland, and I thought, we're near Rothbury. I've never been to Rothbury, and so we're driving to Rothbury. We're driving along the road, and there's a sign. Now, I have to be very careful about how I say what I'm about to say, but I don't want to be charged with inciting people to criminal activity. So I saw a sign on the road from the RTA that said, Rothbury Riot Memorial. My initial impulse, we went on and found, of course, the memorial, which is splendid contribution by the Women's Auxiliary. But I cannot understand how that sign has stood there. Nor do I understand how someone hasn't got out and painted over and said Rothbury, painted out for Rothbury, and so the sign says Police Riot Memorial. But I'm sure there was a time in which that sign, no one would have been going to put it up, and it certainly wouldn't have lasted very long. Now, in talking with James about what I want to say today, one of the things I said to him was, I don't think there should be, indeed there isn't, any formula for how you do a book on a radical city. And the fact the Melbourne ones and then the Brisbane one, the Sydney, I don't think there's any way in which you should copy, anyone should copy what everybody else does, because each city, each place, is different in its own way and needs to express what that structure is. You've got an advantage in one way here, though, that really none of the other big capital cities have. That is, with Jim Doherty's history of Newcastle, you do have a sort of go-to-woe story that you can look at to do your things to intersect with. None of the other big cities in Australia actually have a general history that starts when the city started and goes a long way through. So, as a kind of backstrap, if you want to do something, you've got that. In the preface, or whichever it was, which there's a horror story about writing that preface. I mean, it's called "To Split in the Brisbane Labour History Society." I had nothing to do with me. I didn't know where this was happening, but somebody there thought they were going to write the preface, and the publisher asked me to do it, and I wrote it thinking I was helping out, but it caused this, the egos of the local. I could divert for a moment. I was in Western Australia for a few months in a seminar, and I did a semester's teaching over there in '87, and there was a William Buckley Yeats Society in Perth. It had just split. The 7 members had split.
The centre could not hold.
So the smaller they are. So anyway, this is what happened to the Brisbane Labour. And they've only just in recent years, I was up there and gave a talk to them about on Saturday about the defeat of the anti-communist bill in 1951. So they're back on their feet again. But it really did lay the way for a long time. So there's a warning to you, either let everybody write a preface and a foreword and an introduction, you just go on adding them. Certainly don't allow yourself to fall behind. The old days, in the 50s, of course, or earlier, the Communist Party had cottage lectures, which they invite the neighbours in and get someone to come along and talk about the glories of socialist Bulgaria or something. Politically today, I think what we can do, and I've tried to do with this in Canberra, is to have DVD discussions where you get a political DVD and get a few people in and watch it and then just talk about it afterwards as a way of getting some sort of discussion. Anyway, we won't go to any, we don't go into more detail of that, but those sort of history from beneath the battlefield tools. One of the things that I've always found heart-stopping in Newcastle, and I've gone back to several times, and I'm here visiting with somebody I was taken, is to the Anglican Cathedral and show them the altar. So utensils is the wrong word, isn't it? Items that are made from the melted down wedding rings of the people who lost their husbands and sons and fathers in the First World War. I really want to think about those sorts of things as a little vignette in the book, but I just find that expressing something about that war in a way in which I know nothing else in Australia that actually does in that kind of way. We were talking earlier over lunchtime about the Star Hotel, not just the night of the closure, but the whole history of the Star long before that. I don't know when I first heard about Stowe and Fella, but it was certainly long before I ever came to Newcastle. There's 3 bars, the gay bar at one end, the jazz bar, the workers' bar at the other. I think I was saying to somebody, in my book Gone Tomorrow, which came out in 1982, I've got a paragraph in there about the closure of the Star Hotel as a way of summing up some of the thoughts about social life in Newcastle. I've jumped over from the Cathedral Goal to something else, and that is the tradition of visual arts here. Margaret had organised me to come up and speak when John Turner's book on Lycett was launched. I'm going to go into give one of the John Turner Memorial lectures. But those early drawings, they were the images of the city by Lycett and what they mean in terms of the indigenous population and conflict. Important. But the other, one of my very, very favourite painters in Australia is John Passmore. And those paintings of fishermen as a work experience in the story. And somehow I'll help people get Passmore or a story in one of those scenes that he has of people pulling fishing things as a piece of working class life. But it's something, of course, that has continued with one of the radical sources, I think, kind of off to the side, and that's Anna Wombatouche's gallery, which was an active place in all kinds of ways. Anna, as you know, I just know this from the outside, really, was very significant in that sort of cultural, political progressivism for a very long time in the city, which was witnessed by the enormous amount of support that came on the morning of the earthquake. People rushed around to help after the devastation to her space. I happen to have on my wall at home a painting of Newcastle Harbour by Humphrey McQueen. It's a painting of the wharf at dawn. I love black paintings, I have to tell you. And black and grey, with a little bit of white canvas coming through. But he is, he's now having a big exhibition in Sydney, I discovered, for a moment. But when I bought that about 15 years ago, he just started out and there was an exhibition in Canberra. I was so taken with this Newcastle that painting. And it's in the Passmore tradition of that wharf of the life of working people here. It's sort of got a ladder and a rope hanging down. So in a way, that Passmore, not social realism, but of the working life of Newcastle, is certainly embodied in one of the strands of visual art production that is here. Now, I think a big question that was really never asked properly about the previous radical cities is, who is this book for? I think they mainly decided they were for each other, or for people like them. Now, I think, I don't have to tell you how much has been lost in the general community of understanding of labour history and radical activities across Australia. And therefore, I think we all the time have to be thinking about what we can do to provide materials for the schools. And not just for the secondary schools, for the upper levels of that, but even to provide materials for primary schools. Indeed, know that there are now philosophy for kids that go down to preschool. Whole questions of ideas where just 4-year-olds are discussing death and war, all the things that they see on their television screens. I divert again, so to speak. I have a particular interest in the history of colour in Australia. I don't just mean skins. House paints, roofs, cars, fabrics, everything. And I saw a book, the title was, a picture on the cover, Why Are Orangutans Orange? I never thought about that. So I mentioned to this friend of mine who's a preschool teacher, I said to him, you could ask your kids that. He said, I know what the answer would be. I said, what? He said, my cat's orange. The ways in which kids' minds leap about at that age rather than anything we're sort of going to go with. But we have to go too with providing all sorts of levels of material for the schools. And that probably means thinking up, setting up a website to go with the book. So other material in the book itself can be up there so that the way in which teachers and students now perhaps more happily access material can be done to them in that kind of way. Because there are fewer and fewer, unfortunately, of the converted. So if we're preaching to the converted, it is a narrower and narrower circle. We have to get out there and find ways of making the material available. In the schools, I'm pleased to say, I had a great, delightful revelation earlier this year. You know, how business studies have taken over the secondary curriculum. They might be called legal studies, or all of that, different names in different places. I just assumed that all these courses were being run by failed entrepreneurs who took refuge in the state school system because the businesses had gone back. Not so at all. I'm involved with a group of the grandfather clause to a group of people in their early 20s who are organising to make sure that people of their age and younger get their full award payments in the retail and hospitality sector. And they go around the schools talking to other students, because Canberra has senior colleges, so it's just year 11 and 12. So they go into them and talk to these students and tell them, hand out this material about what the wages should be, that you're being sexually harassed at work, bring this number, and that sort of stuff. Well, what they've discovered in time is that the people running the business courses are in fact people who used to be history teachers. As history's been driven out of people, they have to find another subject to teach. So what they have are these old ex-rads like us who are now teaching business studies in the schools. So they're anxious to get other kinds of material. And the first one that we just contacted all the other business teachers and sent the stuff around to them, circling around there. So there are opportunities out there that you may not immediately suspect. I've just published a second volume coming out of this work I've been doing, it seems like forever, on the history of the Wilderness Labourers Federation. Started on Eureka Day 2004. So that's now almost 7 years since I got, since the president of the Victorian branch, I'd never met. I'd spoken at the Eureka Day in Melbourne in the MUA building. The gentleman asked me, so we're trying to find somebody to write the history of the old BRF. Can't get anyone to take it on. Somebody on the surface said, Humphrey will write it for you. So I had to go and see him in his office a couple of days of the following week. And out of that, I got the commission to write, as he said, the unofficial history, because no two officials would agree about anything, which has indeed proved to be the case. But the first volume I did 2 years ago is called Framework of Flesh, Builders, Labourers, Battle for Health and Safety. And the second volume is called We Built This Country, Builders, Labourers and Their Unions. And what the union very sensibly did from its own point of view as well as mine, they contracted the Workplace Relations Centre at Sydney University to get the history written. And the Workplace Relations Centre with John Buchanan contracted me to write it. So we've got this thing between me and the union, which in the end turned out to be quite necessary, because when I submitted the manuscript, they were all getting ready to put money into publisher to have it out for the centenary of the Federation September last year. Suddenly I have this message saying, some of the members of the executive would actually like to read it. I thought, well, for some of them that would be a stretch. And then I thought, well, I know who in particular wants to read it. And if I were he, I'd be hoping I wasn't in it. But knowing that, I had put him in a way which was going to be pretty safe for all of us. But as the very good official I've been dealing with all along, who handled all of this, he said, some of them just want to see their names in print. So when they got it and read it, one of the Victorian officials made a wonderful suggestion to me. He said, most of our blokes aren't going to do it, but I want them to know something. Why don't you put a timeline? Wonderful idea. So what I've done in the book is to make a timeline that's broken up into sort of sections. There's about 10 examples. The first one at the beginning. So we start with the convicts, of course, who were the first builders labourers. So we start in 1787. So we do a bit of timeline broken up through the book. And what I did, a bit about the builders labourers, a bit about other building unions, about the building industry, the general economy, the general political situation, international events. So we've just got a little plot of histories that never go over 2 pages in a normal size format. Your format there, you probably get 1 page most of the time. But it's just the amount of response I've had to it from people who do read it, saying how wonderful it is. And what I did was to put them all together onto a work file and send that around to people in schools and things, and all kinds of people are saying to me, this is just so useful. They add their local bits of information in, because I can do so much, and add it beyond the building industry. But that's some prospect as to something that you might work out a way of making it appropriate for what you're going to do here. The other thing I've done in both books is to put in little sketch pen portraits of people. It might just take up a single page. So you can get a lot more incidents and people in that way than having to give even 4 or 5 pages over to somebody. And I've introduced some wonderful, wonderful characters. One of my favourites is someone who I know really only by the name of Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson was a navvy working on the railway from Melbourne to the Murray in 1861. And they were being paid, their rate was 5 shillings a day. And because it would rain, they didn't get paid. And they were claiming 30 shillings a week so they could live. And there'd been disputes going on along the line for the last couple of years. And they stopped work, and he went down as the delegation to see the contractor, a man called Bruce, who got £1.4 million out of the Victorian government, and some of which he used to bribe the officials and the politicians to let him do what he liked with the rest of it. And he met Mr. Simpson in the Menzies Hotel. And I presume suggested that perhaps Mr. Simpson could see his way clear to tell the men to go back to work. Instead of which Mr. Simpson said to him, I haven't come to negotiate. I've just come to ask you, are you set on the 5 shillings a day? And if you are, I'm here to tell you we're not going back. And then he went back up the line. Now, the history of the labour movement is made by the Mr. Simpsons and the Miss Simpsons, whose names probably don't even get in the newspaper. But you do find them, they do pop up like this. And in a way, they deserve to be remembered too. And I've got lots of names of individual labourers in the book who appear doing something together. And I thought, no one's ever going to look them up in the index, but they deserve to be there. No one will know they ever existed to try and find something like that in the name, but they deserve that bit of honour if they manage to break through into the minute book somewhere about some particular thing that they've done. So those sorts of inserts can be done, little pen portraits, or indeed if there's a photograph or a cartoon or a sketch or something that can just be used to illustrate a simple point, to take up a page or half a page or a column of information beside it explaining what it is. One of the ones many of you will remember were the builders' labourers who were complaining about the lack of amenities on their site, and they went stripped out of their work shorts and showered themselves on the steps of the town hall in the early 1970s. You just need that photograph, and what you really just need is the news item, because the news item beside it, tells you what this thing was. But you, with all your resources, will know lots more of these around the area that you're going to deal with. Then, the other thing, of course, to do is to break out key quotations. Sort of make them stand out from the rest of the thing if someone says stuff. I found a wonderful man in Tasmania who was the organiser of the Builders Labourers Federation there during the First World War, Samuel Champ. I reckon I've turned Samuel Champ into a historical character because of what he said, and I've found and put in the book, and henceforth it'll be quoted endlessly. Well, I know it already is. People are putting it out and sending it around. Sam Champ used to speak in the Domain every Sunday, and he would recite radical poetry. And indeed, he did that remarkable thing in 1916 at what was the equivalent of the ACTU. He recited a poem at the ACTU Congress when he got up to speak. But one of the great speeches he made, which was reported in the Labour daily newspaper in Hobart, called the Daily Post, I'll extemporise for you, but you get the point powerfully enough. Our liberties, he said, were not won by mining magnates and stock exchange jobbers, but by ordinary men and women of the working class, who suffered imprisonment and died on the gallows. It is to these ordinary workers that we owe the liberties we enjoy today. Now, I'm sure the history of Newcastle will find similar and equivalent quotations and things to break out as major things to be able to pass on, because in a way they're the things that people take away. They're the things people, as I do, remember, memorise this, and a few lines of verse every now and again too, of course. Just a couple of lines of it, or a quatrain or something. When I talk about my book on the Builders Labourers, I always begin with Mary Gilmore. I am he who paved the way, that you might walk at your ease today. I split the rock, I felled the tree, the nation was because of me. Shame on the mouth that would deny the knotted hands that set us high. She's talking about old Botany Bay, but it applies to working people anywhere in the world. And I'm sure you'll find radical verses from around here to express that and just break those out. That's the story as well. There are also little incidents of things that happen that are just wonderful in themselves, but they don't amount to a kind of article or a short essay. We all know the stories in the First World War of people handing out white feathers to people who they thought should have gone off and got themselves killed. We know that the IWW had this counter-argument of the people they referred to as the Would to God Brigade. Would to God I were not so rich, then I could volunteer. They had this whole list of people. Would to God I were not this, would to God I were not that. Then I too could go and join the RAF. Well, in Hobart, the president of the Master Builders Association was an alderman, very common accommodation activities, and called Alderman Dunn. And he took a builder's labourer to court to have him bound over. The convict era never really ended in Tasmania, because the builder's labourer had pursued Alderman Dunn down Argyle Street, shouting after him that he should go to the front and get shot along with his two sons. Now, I mean, this is just a tiny little news article, but it does reverse the whole notion of the white feather, of the workers actually chasing the bourgeoisie and turning it back on them and their claims to patriotism. So it doesn't have to be about war, of course, but lots, just little single things like that you can take out and has little news breakouts. So that in these days, for people looking at things, I don't want the whole book to look like a kind of Facebook page, but in a way in which there are people can make small bits out of things and pick up and get through them. But one of the things we found with the Wilderness Labourers books is that by breaking things out and having little sections of things, people who think they can't read a book will turn it over and find a paragraph and think, I could read that much. And then they think, oh, that did it. And then they start reading paragraphs. And the more kind of breaks, subheads there are, the more columns and things there are, the easier it is for the Wilderness Labourers in this case, for ordinary folks. Many of them, of course, don't have English as their first language as well.
Would that be the role of an editor to do that, or that each writer should pick their own place?
Well, I think it's something that, I don't know how you're doing it, but I think it's something that the kind of coordinating committee should talk about and encourage people to contribute these things. Then it becomes a layout question, because you don't want it looking like a dog's breakfast. You want all that looking strong and professional. There's nothing worse than people looking at it and thinking, this is just a mess. If this is the best they can do with layout, then clearly they're not serious about what they're trying to tell me. So you've got to do that work. But I think it's something that, I don't know how many of you are involved with that sort of administrative level, but if you're all here and interested, I think the notion of you all contributing these bits and pieces and people who aren't here, is sort of something that you can invite people to be able to do. I made it very clear in writing the history of the Wilderness Labourers Federation, particularly the broad brush history, that I wasn't going to leave out the villains, the thieves and the drunks. Partly because the workers themselves know that they exist. This is not a surprise for ordinary union members to discover that some of their officials are not all they might have been. But more importantly, I think, if we don't face up to this, people aren't organised and prepared to prevent it happening again. So there's a real political motive of saying that, as I say about Norm Gallagher, Norm knew better than anyone that the capitalists were out to destroy the union, and they do anything to do that. And if that meant corrupting people, that's what they would do. And the fact that Norm, I don't understand. I'm glad I wasn't writing a biography of Norm Gallagher, but we put it like that. The most complex, extraordinary person. Getting to the minutes of it. Left school at 12, really. Huge ability. Read what he just read the minutes. I'm exhausted reading the minutes. Let alone thinking he was actually doing these things. Anyway, but I think it's important to think of having some examples of this, labour rats, to how this happens, not just to put in only the good people and the good things, to show people how all of us are open to being corrupted. Not just with money, vanity, sex, gambling, We just know what happens to politicians and to union officials. And unless there's a group of people around you to protect you, your friends and your comrades, then it can happen to anyone. And that's the political reason why I think that it certainly should be in. I'm not sure how, and I think we should certainly think of how you're going to weave the sporting traditions of Newcastle into the working class radical history. Andrew Moore, who wrote the history of North Sydney rugby league as a kind of class social history, because North Sydney was a rough working class area in the early 19th century, the early 20th century when the league got started. When Murdoch tried to take over the league, Andrew was one of the active opponents of this and tried to get people active. And you will remember, of course, the vote as to whether the Knights would go along with it or not was going to be held. And Andrew had then no connections with Newcastle really. And so he and a couple of other people came up here on the Saturday morning with some sort of leaflets to hand out that would encourage people to vote no. And as he got there to the stadium we were going to be, 95% of the membership were queued up already to vote no. Nothing that he could tell them about what they want to do to keep Murdoch out of their team. So, there must be, that's one of the story that I happen to know about. But the ways in which that political sense of teams and sporting activity and there's Darcy and the sense of pride of place that is in Newcastle because of the way in which the class and the sporting things are moving together is something that I hope we'll be able to get in. The other thing that I've left to last, and the second one, the things I want to leave you with, is thinking way back into environmental struggles here, long before there were people called Greens. I think in the BLF, I discovered that the earliest example of an environmental statement by a labourers' union I found in Australia was in 1900. And they passed a resolution to oppose the alienation of harbour foreshores. I don't say why, but knowing what I know about general history at the time, that those harbour foreshores on the North Shore were places where working people who were out of work camped. Workers took their families there on Sunday picnics. Workers went fishing and swimming there. Now, so I think we have to keep alert to the ways in which very early on, my friend Tim Bonahay's book, The Colonial Earth, has traced environmental protests right back to the 1790s around Australia. Attempts by people to protect the environment all the way through the 19th century. So, you're thinking of a coal town and those things. It was also very clear in writing the history of health and safety for the workers' labourers, the framework of Fleshpool, that the environment is an essential part of the struggle of working class people to get air to breathe. Len Richardson, who wrote a history of the workers on the south coast in the interwar period, has a story in there which he told me that. He said, I was sitting in the workers' club down there talking to these old English communists who've long retired. So they were just talking about those days and what they'd done. And he said to them, because most of them have been, of course, been in the war. In England they've been in the British Army, and then sometime in the 20s they migrated to Australia. And he said to them, why did you join the Communist Party? And one of them said, so that when I came out of the mine at midday, I could see the sun. He did not want Australia to become like those pit communities in England, where everything was just blackened by the coal and the soot all the time. So what I'm just saying is that there's a long history to think back in there as to the ways in which people thought about place and space. Now, the last question, I believe, is, I don't think there's any doubt about the answer to this question for you, but the question is, whose side are you on? Are you writing even-handed academic objective history? Or are you providing materials to help people forward their struggles now and into the future? Because so much of what has happened around the big journal labour history has just become an academic activity, producing articles that are unreadable. No one reads them, I'm sure. The editor might read them, the referees might read them. I read the summary and the conclusion and look at the footnotes. And I think that's what most people do. In fact, I wrote a piece about this recently and sent it around on the website called exactly Whose Side Are You On? The Mundane Demise of Labour History. I got a lot of responses back from people who were deeply involved in this academically and said, yes, this is what has happened. There's nothing in the journal for working people. And they have no connection with the union movement, the labour movement in any organised way. The local branches too. The Brisbane branch where I was about, the South Coast branch, Melbourne, Adelaide got started again. The Adelaide branch has been involved with protests against the Rand government's cuts to civil public service conditions over there. Those small regional branches are doing this, and I hope, almost certain, that that's the kind of spirit in which the radical Newcastle will have to emerge from. Otherwise, the people you put in it will rise from their graves and haunt us all forever.